Welcome everybody to today's CRESR Seminar. This is the fifth in our series. We've got 7, I think, overall in the series this academic year. So welcome this morning. My name is Rob Macmillan. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at CRESR, and I'll be kind of chairing the session today. We're delighted to be joined by Allison Boddy from the University of Kent. A very warm welcome to you, Ali. Who's going to speak on the subject of philanthropic citizenship and education. It's a really important topic. I'll introduce Ali properly in a moment, but first a couple of housekeeping things just in terms of the seminar. So firstly, please do keep microphones on mute. Secondly, we're going to be recording the session. You'll see the recording button is on already. Now, usually we'd like to say, oh, please keep your cameras on, because it just makes it easier for a speaker. They're not just speaking into a void or just shouting at their laptop. But because we are recording it, if you'd rather not be seen on the recording, please do feel free to turn your cameras off. Ali's going to be speaking for about 30 to 35 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for some questions and discussion, all being well. So please do put questions and comments into the chat, and I'll draw on them. I'll kind of ask people to raise them directly. We can ask some of them after Ali has finished speaking. Okay, let me introduce Ali now. I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce her. So Dr. Allison Boddy, she's Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Philanthropy at the University of Kent. It's part of a very vibrant cluster of academics and researchers looking at questions of philanthropy, volunteering, charitable giving, and the voluntary sector generally. Before developing her academic career, Ali was the Chief Executive of a children's charity and a lead commissioner in a statutory agency, a local authority, lead commissioning officer for early intervention services. So she's always had an interest in children's services and children's role in charitable work and philanthropy. Ali is a leading light in thinking critically and passionately about the role of philanthropy in terms of social justice. And her focus today is on how we think about cultivating children's philanthropic citizenship in primary education. So without further ado then, over to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real honour to be able to speak about this, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I can just have some thumbs up from people that's working okay. Super. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I'll kick off then. So as Rob says, my name is Ali Boddy. I'm a senior lecturer with the Centre for Philanthropy at the University of Kent. And I'm particularly kind of here today to talk about the idea of cultivating children's philanthropic citizenship. If you read any of my work, you'll see that I tend to be interested in 2 main things: children and charity. So far, this has led me to consider how charity impacts on children's lives, for example, through the commissioning of children's services, the role of voluntary action in education, and the longer-term impacts of youth participation programmes on young people's civic behaviours. But within this, I've always had a really long-term interest in children's rights and children's participation, which I think underpins kind of much of my work. In my life before academia, as Rob was saying, I was heavily involved in children and youth participation projects, both as a commissioner and as a CEO. And I'm now also the founder and director of a small community organisation which seeks to foster children's active environmental engagement. Along with my research, of course, all of these activities influence upon my work and my approach. And this has led me to taking a real kind of research focus now on how children learn to give and the spaces and places that are available for them to develop their philanthropic behaviours. And indeed, how these spaces and places are also influenced by other philanthropic actors and philanthropic action. And I think it's important to say here from the outset that overall I favour a justice-orientated approach to citizenship and philanthropic giving, which I'll expand on later. And I come from a viewpoint that very much sees children as capable social actors who are experts of their own lives and of their own experiences, and as current citizens who should be able to shape the world that they are part of, and not simply as future citizens to mould into existing systems and structures. This also isn't about developing a rhetoric about how to grow children as future donors within the current systems and structures, but is instead about using a multidisciplinary research and theoretical approach to help understand how we can support and facilitate children to be socially engaged at any age in ways that match their development stage and their competencies, and to support them to critically consider current and potential new ways of being through their philanthropic actions. I also want to acknowledge from the outset that children's experiences are shaped by a huge range of different factors. And whilst today I focus on education as one of the spaces where children engage in philanthropic behaviours, there are of course lots of others. In doing so, I want to draw on some of the tensions though that perhaps exist between narratives of philanthropy versus those narratives that are within education. For example, within literature exploring philanthropy and charitable giving, there is an intense focus on how to encourage individuals to give more and more frequently. However, less attention is paid to thinking about how individuals develop their giving behaviours and the discourse and narratives that surround this. And today I hope to critically consider this through the lens of some of the dominant narratives within education, such as character education, global citizenship, and bringing into this as well the civil society agenda. And basically, I argue that some of the deeply rooted norms for encouraging charitable giving and philanthropic behaviours in schools are potentially counterintuitive to fostering long-term active philanthropic citizenship. I'm not seeking to present a singular research project today, though I'm very happy to take any questions on any of the projects that I mentioned, but instead I would like to more kind of draw together the learning from across my research and the different projects that are mentioned here as a summative analysis of what's happening when we consider children's philanthropic citizenship. And the main point to take away here that this is an evolving and an iterative area of work with multiple studies hoping to bring in different perspectives to the field. And I really welcome your critical engagement with them. For example, does the argument stand up to scrutiny? Are there bodies of work that we're overlooking? And all of this is hopefully going to help inform kind of the next steps as well as this research develops. Before we go too far though, I think we need to take a moment to consider the very concept and notion of philanthropy. There is no fixed, universally agreed upon, unchanging definition of philanthropy. It's a very complex and contested term that can be very ideologically loaded and has been, rightly so in my opinion, subject to much criticism as well as subject to much praise. So Peyton and Moody define philanthropy in its broadest sense as voluntary action for the public good, which includes the giving of money, giving of time, getting involved in voluntary action and associations, including charities, grassroots campaigns, non-profits and foundations, so on. Bernholtz, for me, in her new book, How We Give Now, perhaps goes a step further, and I welcome this. So examining all formal and informal ways that we give in our everyday interactions. So from everything from our charitable giving, but also including our social responsible purposes to digital giving of data and knowledge and our helping behaviours. She very much views giving as a form of participation, stating that philanthropy by the rest of us across geographies and cultural traditions begins with and builds on active commitment to our communities. I tend to also favour these broader definitions and view philanthropic actions as an act of participation. In terms of education, these actions and activities get called a variety of different things, from the dominant terminology of social action, which has very much been favoured by things like the I Will campaign, to active citizenship, kindness, virtues, helping behaviours, volunteering, mutual aid, fundraising, charitable giving, good character, etc. So I'm going to really briefly touch on some of the wider literature that sits around some of the giving behaviours which informs this work. So whilst really quite well discussed in youth studies, to date, very little research has actually focused on the philanthropic activities and engagement of younger children. Yet educational, social and psychology theory and research highlights that the middle period of childhood is absolutely crucial in the development and normalisation of civic behaviours, which is why it's an area of such interest for me. Known research into philanthropic citizenship and charitable giving, such as my own and Power and Smith's, suggests that children are very willing and are very generous with their time, their talents and their treasures. And US-based research and research based here in the UK highlights that charity is a really deeply rooted norm in younger children. Likewise, research reveals that children are really positive about charity, with high expectations of charity to solve social ills. And this again has been supported by my own research in this area. Theoretical understandings of charity, of children's giving behaviours are often concerned with children's prosociality and tend to come from kind of two interlocking bodies of research, with some assuming that philanthropic behaviours are driven by situational factors such as family, school, community, whilst others focus on the individual characteristics of children, highlighting intrinsic ideas of kindness and empathy. The likelihood here and what we sort of take on board here is that the combination of this nature-nurture approach all influence children's philanthropic citizenship. So then, moving on to the central concepts that's up for debate today, philanthropic citizenship. I define philanthropic citizenship as a dimension of citizenship behaviour which is associated with intentions and actions that intend to produce public benefit, for example, volunteering, social action, charitable giving, advocacy and activism, but many others are included in there. Whilst this is a concept I think we can think about across all ages, of course, again, I'm particularly interested in how we think about this concept within terms of philanthropic citizenship education, and particularly with younger children. I also try and draw on a range of literature to inform this concept, so considering ideas from philanthropy, from education philosophy, character virtues, psychology and global citizenship literature, and I'll draw on various elements of this as I do my talk today. Within philanthropy literature, a body of work focuses on the concept of philanthropic virtues, for example, Shervish's and Martin's work. Within this virtues framework, philanthropic actions are viewed as an act or an activity built upon many widely recognised virtues, including generosity, compassion, courage, fairness, integrity, etc. Virtues are then considered as traits of character which provide individuals with morally desirable ways of relating to people, practices and communities. Therefore, adopting a character virtues lens on philanthropy by encouraging and cultivating these virtues, we will increase philanthropic behaviours. Nonetheless, critics of a character virtue approach within an educational context point out that a focus on personal ethics means that broader social and political and environmental issues are addressed at an individual level rather than at a community, local or global level. Swiss states, for example, without a moral radical conception of just what the political means, and without engaging children in debates about how political aims, ideas and values are intertwined with, yet importantly distinct from, moral values, there is no hope of engaging children in the pursuit of a more socially just and less oppressive society. Peterson then, from the Jubilee Centre for Character Virtues, though, goes on to suggest that we shouldn't be looking at character virtues and citizenship as binary ideas, and instead they should be viewed as interconnected. And as Martin then highlights, it is the combination of these virtues put into philanthropic action, which he argues provides a forum for moral creativity, for putting our version of a good society into practice, and for fostering caring relationships that enrich individuals and communities alike. Weighing some of this up, I, along with others, argue that character and virtues literature can inform our thinking, but within that, we also need to move beyond ideas of the individual and move towards an active citizenship approach to philanthropic giving, which seeks to embrace this critical thinking and justice orientation, where children are simultaneously encouraged to develop the virtues to respond to social needs, whilst critically exploring and engaging with wider issues that sit behind the notions of charity. This fits alongside Westenheim and Kahn's research, within which they identify 3 types of citizenship promoted by educational programmes: the personally responsible, the participatory, and the socially just. So the personally responsible programme focuses on an individual's character, working on the assumption that to solve problems in society, individuals must be responsible, law-abiding, honest, and possess identified civic virtues such as integrity, grit, resilience, and kindness. For example, this person would donate to the food bank, but not necessarily challenge the underlying causes and inequalities that give rise to the food bank. As I'll suggest in the upcoming slides, this is the most common type of engagement children have with charity in primary education. The participatory citizen concerns a type of citizenship that is promoted through social action and service learning education, where individuals are encouraged to actively participate in their community within the current community structures. So the core assumption here is that to solve social problems, citizens must actively participate and lead on community action programmes. For example, they would organise a collection for the food bank, but still work within the current established systems, but not seek to question those established systems and structures. And we see a lot of this sort of activity in many of the social action programmes here in the UK. So these discourses are most commonly rooted as well in ideas of employability, development of skills and future opportunities, rather than having a justice orientation. Finally, the less common, the justice-orientated education programmes would ideally engage in participatory and personally responsible behaviour, because these are still seen as both very important, while simultaneously developing the knowledge and capabilities to critically question the established systems. Assess social, political and economic structures and address the root causes of problems, critically assessing the problem and seeking for structural change to find solutions to these societal problems like food poverty. However, as Westenheimer also points out, what's really important here is the combination of the experiential and practical learning, as we see in terms of volunteering and social action programs, alongside the knowledge-heavy kind of critical thinking programs, which promotes the most justice-orientated citizenship. And this develops the critical capacity to affect systemic change, challenge established systems of power through understanding the democratic processes and campaigns on root causes of the political problems. It is within this justice-orientated framework that I tend to consider philanthropic citizenship education. As Bernard Crick puts it, education should not shelter our nation's children from even the harshest controversies of adult life, but should prepare them to deal with such controversies knowledgeably, sensibly, tolerantly, and morally. And for me, this applies to just as much to how we engage children in philanthropy as it does to any other area of citizenship. Drawing quickly then on the policy drivers for growing philanthropic behaviours through education. This kind of comes from two interlinked policy contexts, with education obviously being the dominant one and civil society. So sociologists, educationalists and social policy scholars have long been concerned with this idea of how do we raise good citizens, with volunteering and giving seen as really important factors. So this approach has been reflected in the English education policy over the successive governments, from Labour's focus on social and emotional learning to the current Conservative focus on character education. Particularly enthused about character education, Nicky Morgan, who was Education Secretary from 2014 to 16, dedicated over 14.5 million to character education initiatives. Building on this, Damien Hines, who was then the Education Secretary from 2018-19, there were a lot of them, set out the quality benchmarks for Ofsted to begin to monitor schools on their character education from September 2019, which was implemented by Gavin Williamson, who was then 2019 to 2021 Education Secretary, and with the most recent Secretary Nadim Zahawi taking a firm, if not controversial, stance on how political issues are discussed in schools. However, as discussed in the previous slides, a significant number of critics of this direction of travel, including myself to some degree, have criticised it for taking an approach which, as Jerome and Kisby call it, seeks to fix the kids rather than the problems in society, and rather than teach our children to question wider structural inequalities or root causes to social problems. This is potentially quite far removed from Bernard Crick's initial conceptualisation of citizenship education in the late 1990s and 2000s, in which he highlighted the importance of political literacy, engagement and debate. Whilst this was focused on secondary education, the influence of this shift in the political agenda to one of neoliberal and market-orientated personalised responsibility has impacted how citizenship overall is taught within schools, as highlighted by Weinberg and Flinders research in their 2018 study. They suggested that teachers now show a tendency to confuse active citizenship with service learning, understanding it through a lens of good manners, volunteering, and extracurricular opportunities. So indeed, service learning, volunteering, and community action have remained consistent pillars of the education agenda under the disguise of good citizenship. This fits really well with the responsibilization agenda of recent and successive governments, where citizens are expected to take increasing personal responsibility for their own educational, health and welfare needs, with significantly increased expectation on communities to address societal challenges. So again, such thinking ties neatly in with Labour's kind of promotion of the third way, and then increased substantially under the Conservatives' promotion of the big society. The ideological narrative of the big society, coupled with the political reality of austerity and public sector cuts, has put increasing focus back on charity and voluntary action as an alternative. And whilst the language of big society has perhaps dropped away from the Conservative narrative now, the focus on neighbourhoods, communities and local social action has not. And this has become a dominant feature of how children are engaged. This is also encapsulated in the civil society strategy through an intent to focus on neighbourhoods and volunteering. And more recently, some of these tensions have perhaps been highlighted by the controversies around the DfE's new guidance on political impartiality in schools, in which teachers and schools responded angrily to prescriptive guidance about what they could and could not discuss in the classroom, arguing that such guidance would perhaps undermine engagement of children in critical thinking. Finally, it's also worth noting that there's also some other interesting tensions and challenges here from a philanthropy perspective. Whilst we mainly are discussing how children learn philanthropic behaviours within education today, we can't overlook the fact that philanthropy has played a really important role in shaping citizenship and in shaping character education here in the UK, with many prominent funders directing funds into research, practice and civil society organisations to work in partnership with schools to promote and provide citizenship education programmes across all types of, so from the personally responsible right up to social justice orientated. Okay, so now we've set the research and policy picture, I just want to move on to thinking about how children do engage with ideas of charity. It has become really commonplace for children to be engaged in philanthropic activities within their schools, both here in the US and Europe, and most commonly through large-scale charitable appeals. So this has resulted in what Power and Taylor argue as charities increasingly becoming mainstream in education. And they go on to suggest that this is really quite problematic, as we are essentially teaching charity as a response to social ills rather than critically exploring any other solutions, such as governmental responses and societal change. And whilst my own research with colleagues shows that schools really do go to great lengths to encourage, support and engage children of all ages in voluntary action and charitable giving, which creates a really strong enthusiasm for giving and supporting others, and something that we absolutely should celebrate, there is concerning evidence that children's involvement in charitable giving via schools is often passive and often tokenistic. Importantly, this passive, tokenistic, transactional nature of giving could be counterintuitive to long-term goals of provoking social change. So research conducted by myself and colleagues presented qualitative evidence from an in-depth 6-week-long participative action research project with 150 children in the UK, and they were all aged between 4 and 8 years old. And we were exploring their experiences, perceptions and preferences regarding charitable giving. This research highlighted that most children positively engage in charitable giving and recognise large national brands, such as some of the ones that we see here. However, conversely, the data also suggested that less than 20% of these children were aware of the charitable cause area that sat behind the campaign they were being asked to support, and even less than that, children were afforded any decision-making in their giving. So this included a lack of discussion about which causes they supported, how they supported them, and why. Furthermore, we also found in this research that children understood giving most commonplace as a transactional act, where giving was then associated with the idea of getting a reward, such as £1 for a cupcake. And this was much less common in this was any understanding about what that money was going to. So as outlined previously, while research suggests that children are naturally altruistic, concern is then raised that by encouraging giving as a transactional act, we risk overriding these intrinsic behaviours with these external rewards, and thus we're teaching giving for reward rather than encourage altruistic tendencies and critical engagement in charitable giving. So nonetheless, though, our participative action research project, through this, the children were then actively encouraged to critically question cause areas which mattered to them in a child-led and age-appropriate way, and to explore these issues in that age-appropriate way and consider how they wanted to respond. And in this, children then engaged in a wide range of socially motivated activities, from campaigning for local change, writing to their MPs, gifting of their own belongings to others, and fundraising for charities that they found through co-researching with others, which supported causes that they chose. More importantly, though, most of these children then kept visual diaries of their activities, and they were very confident in talking others through their journey and their philanthropic decision-making, often framing their rationale in ideas of justice, fairness, and equality. Interestingly for us, after the project ended and we had all finished, around 30% of the children still continued to sustain or engage in these philanthropic activities, which were led by them, but of course facilitated and supported by the adults around them, either teachers or parents. They, through this, became proponents of change under this active citizenship framework. Following this, I and colleagues then turned our attention to organisations fundraising through primary schools. We tested dominant fundraising practices in education against normative theories of fundraising ethics. And through this process, we then argued that a lot of the fundraising practices that were happening in schools were largely unethical if we look at them through the lens of children's rights as enshrined in the UN CRC. Didn't recognise children's status as a donor and encouraged this tokenistic participation. So in that paper, we called for fundraising organisations and schools to take a more active and critically reflective role in cultivating children's philanthropic citizenship. This isn't to argue on any level that this fundraising in schools is a bad thing. Many of these organisations do fantastic jobs in fundraising and then redistributing that money out to a lot of good causes. What we really want to critically question here is the how that activity happens. So now moving on then to the spaces and places where children engage with ideas of voluntary action. For example, one of these would be storytelling. So storytelling has long been recognised as a really important aspect of children's moral and pro-social learning and development, and thus literature has a vital role in helping children develop their philanthropic citizenship from a young age. So Nussbaum specifically investigates the role of literature in developing children's civic responsibilities and global citizenship. And she points out a causal relationship between the development of children's morality and literature, arguing that the arts can support us not only to understand and be motivated to participate morally, but also enable us to put that into practice in our own conduct and decision making. Inspired by this, we examined over 500 of the most popular children's picture books, identifying around 1/4 of these which contained ideas of voluntary action or giving as a central theme. Critically analysing the narratives and pictures in this, we found several problematic trends. First, continuing a narrow kind of individualised and responsible citizenship, philanthropic action was almost always framed as an individual act of personal responsibility, which took place in a private sphere and focused on singular acts of kindness and generosity, rather than linking with any wider social action or collective action or challenging the status quo. Second, continuing the market-orientated and transactional ideas of giving we highlighted previously. Over 90% of these books sampled included the giver being rewarded for their giving at the end. And then perhaps more problematically, third, our findings highlighted problematic gender typecasting, with male characters being twice as likely to be involved in action-based causes than females, for example, rescuing animals, building shelters, whereas female characters were always twice as likely to be involved in social issues, including caring for the elderly, helping at the food bank, etc. And again, were more than twice as likely to be involved in supporting family and friends through helping behaviours and social action. This finding is in keeping with wider analysis of children's picture books, which finds that the continued portrayal of females in traditional gendered roles is problematic. Another interesting gendered theme here, though, was the role of a matriarchal character, either normally a mother or a grandmother type figure. These characters were commonly portrayed as pivotal in the story and as caring and nurturing, encouraging, explaining, or facilitating the giving. These background females scaffolded the giving in terms of care, compassion, service, duty, and often self-sacrifice. Whilst male characters do feature as these supportive background scaffolding characters, they were all commonly portrayed as powerful and gatekeepers to change. For example, as landlords, developers, and those in position of political power, such as the town mayor or a member of parliament. Such findings echo and reinforce the misguided gendered assumptions that are often made about civil society, in which the practices of women are framed as helping and lending a hand, whereas male roles are seen as much more active in civil society, as recently argued by Muddiman et al. Fourth, overall, there was a real lack of ethnic and cultural diversity. And this was coupled with some books featuring really problematic intersects of philanthropy, race, and/or privilege. Again, this has been identified by scholars previously within wider analysis of children's picture books. However, looking at this phenomena through the lens of philanthropic citizenship, I think offers even more insight. The majority of the picture books within the project portray characters of seemingly white European or white US descent, shown in privileged situations. Indeed, these characters are 3 times more likely to be the giver in these books than people from all other ethnic backgrounds. As Koss points out, children who interact with current picture books predominantly see white faces and unfortunately receive the message that to be white is better. Where individuals from different ethnic backgrounds are prominently featured, these characters are 8 times more likely to be portrayed as living in deprived situations. Furthermore, giving in those situations was framed much more in the context of mutual aid and local community action, where communities gave to one another to improve their local community. Whereas characters from a white European or white US descent, and as I say, often the more privileged backgrounds, were more often heroized within these books, with their giving framed as acts of benevolence towards the needy. Such framing potentially promotes what Jeffress terms as a politics of benevolence, where privileged global citizens give to the needy other, reproducing the unequal power relations between those who help and those who are in need of being helped, rather than promoting ideas of working with others to bring about different ways of being. We did then purposefully sample books which bucked that trend and appeared potentially well placed to help encourage children's philanthropic citizenship by promoting ideas of philanthropic actions, which include aspects such as active participation of children who are viewed as competent, and where the philanthropic response was critically considered, ethical and appropriate. These books encouraged justice-orientated critical thinking and political engagement, and were often based on real-life scenarios and resisted the stereotypes that we've just discussed. Interestingly, though, more often than not, these books had been developed in partnership with a charity and promoted children as active, powerful and engaged social actors. What is worrying about all of this, though, is that it chimes quite closely with research that I've conducted over lockdown, where I analysed 45 learning resources provided by charities to encourage acts of philanthropy. Within these resources, similar ideas of transaction and personally responsible philanthropic behaviours, which often reproduce gender, racial and cultural typecasting, were portrayed, and a politics of benevolence was still evident. Given that the narrative of character education is quite dominant in schools, promoted by government ministers, DFE and now Ofsted, it is perhaps unsurprising that many charitable organisations providing these philanthropic resources in education have now adopted similar narratives, focusing on personal responsibility rather than justice-orientated ideas. In these resources, we saw a split of around 80-20, with 80% of the resources framed in the personally responsible service learning narratives, and only about 20% which were more justice orientated, discussing and critically engaging children with discussions around food poverty, homelessness, refugees, and some discussing protest groups such as Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg. This isn't to suggest that these were endorsing or promoting any particular views, but instead they were critically exploring in age-appropriate ways why some of these issues, groups and movements existed. And the resources presented, whilst all age-appropriate, were developed reflective of the charitable organisation's pedagogical approach and then adapted to each age group. For me, what is really interesting here is the wider range of philanthropic actors who are at play within this space. So many charities delivering in this space are often now falling into line with wider narratives of personally responsible citizenship when working with schools, adopting market-orientated service learning approaches, understanding good citizenship as a set of individualised responsibilities. Yet at the same time, there are a number of charities and indeed funders who are purposefully taking a more justice-orientated stance. And we see this playing out both in the resources in schools and, as I was just saying, the children's literature. Indeed, there are several notable funders and charities actively seeking to encourage children and young people's active philanthropic citizenship. And I think there is something particularly interesting here about the potential marketisation of the role of charities in schools, which does require further investigation. I'm currently undertaking interviews with a range of actors on this topic, exploring the role of civil society in promoting children's philanthropic citizenship. In conducting these interviews with teachers, the emerging findings suggest that teachers themselves recognise the tensions playing out and themselves also feel really conflicted about what issues they can and cannot raise with children. So school ethos, parental attitudes and confidence in their own skills to navigate discussions around issues of social justice and giving all impact on this. Thus, schools often turn to these external resources, such as charities, to help them navigate these issues and rely on them in doing so. What is also noted here is that, and it is important to note, is that the very type of activities that children are engaging in are often very much dependent upon the levels of deprivation and socioeconomic circumstances where their school is also located. So indeed, recent research by the RSA as part of the RSA4 programme highlighted that teachers and head teachers believe in the importance of social action during the primary phase of education. Nonetheless, schools located in the most deprived areas have fewer opportunities for pupils to take part and lead in social action. And furthermore, they found that many teachers felt that issues of food poverty, LGBT issues and refugee settlement were inappropriate to discuss with children aged 8 to 9 years old. Whilst this project for me provided an absolutely excellent foundation for understanding how children and schools engage in children's philanthropic behaviours, I do suggest that we need to do further research in this area. And finally, as our ongoing research into the role of voluntary action in schools highlights that I do with my colleague Eddie Hogg, there is another interesting phenomena here as we see fundraising activities in primary schools significantly increasing, where primary schools are raising more and more of their own funds to support their children's education. And children are increasingly involved in fundraising for their own education resources, such as books, outdoor spaces, and even well-being support. So schools in wealthier areas tend to raise significantly more than those in the more deprived areas, which we overall argue contributes to ongoing inequality in education. However, there's another really interesting dimension here about what we're teaching children about charity and about fundraising when they themselves are part of that and their education is what's being fundraised for. So kind of bringing this all together, our emerging conceptualisation of philanthropic citizenship then is informed by a children's rights pedagogy, drawing on ideas of educational philosophers such as Biesta, Frere, Lippmann and Dewey, who all argue that education should be a space of moral reasoning, democratic questioning, critical inquiry, which ultimately seeks to serve social justice and equality. Within the classroom, educational philosophers such as Biesta have suggested that the whole purpose of education is to give people space for this democratic reasoning and for this moral questioning. Approaches based on this philosophy would encourage teachers and children to engage in critical debate and discussion around the topics of charity, pro-sociality and giving from the earliest age. Not only, as research suggests, is this likely to increase children's long-term propensity to give and engagement in civil society, but it also promotes the ideas of inclusion, social good and social justice, which extend beyond the ad hoc moment of fundraising and engages children in consideration about how they may seek to engage in and help address wider social issues. As discussed, Westenheimer offers a really good example of this, highlighting that we can teach children to give to the food bank or we can teach children to give to the food bank while simultaneously questioning why that food bank exists and begin to consider the structural inequalities which surround food poverty. He argues that this would be a better outcome for the beneficiaries of food poverty by increasing understanding and compassion while equipping children with the skills to help dismantle existing structural inequalities, as I say, that result in this food poverty. And this ties in with Power and Taylor's concern about the mainstreaming of charities in schools, which presents charities as a solution to the range of social ills, normalising these issues and risks downplaying the approaches to address social inequality, including government responsibilities. Nonetheless, we argue that the normalisation of individualised, market-orientated approaches to philanthropic citizenship happen frequently in primary education, and this does require further attention. Charity, philanthropy, and giving provide a really ideal platform for children to consider these ideas and debates, but without meaningful engagement, this is not only a missed opportunity, but can indeed be counterintuitive to fostering children's long-term philanthropic citizenship by overriding those natural altruistic tendencies and normalising charity rather than social justice. The fact that this activity takes place in schools, though, for me is particularly important, as this is a space where children have the right to expect to engage in meaningful and democratic citizenship education, and education provides a unique context for engaging children in philanthropic giving. The lessons we teach children in this context matter and have lasting consequences for their propensity to give, engagement in social justice and democratic thinking as both current and future citizens, and also have lasting consequences for our civil society. It is a space in which philanthropic citizenship should extend beyond monetary donations and consider how we can all work together to debate, consider and reimagine alternative ways to the current ways of being. The good news is that there are many schools, many funders and many charities in this arena who are already critically considering and thinking about the engagement of younger children, so such as the RSA4 programme that I highlighted earlier. And I'm constantly impressed by the efforts of funders, practitioners, educators and children themselves in demanding children's greater participative engagement in creating and considering these alternative ways of being through philanthropic actions. And whilst I've outlined many issues today, I don't want us to lose sight of the countless amazing examples that there are. What I do want us to consider is how we minimise the problems and how we instead maximise the possibilities. What I hope to have highlighted is that currently philanthropic citizenship education is being shaped by multiple actors in multiple different ways to multiple different ends, from policy actors shaping education in schools to the foundations who fund the work, to the charities who deliver different programmes with schools, to schools and teachers themselves who deliver or facilitate programmes and activities, to how children and young people themselves interpret and engage in these programmes of giving. Some actors, though, have far more power and voice in that space than others, meaning that ideas of the personally responsible citizenship currently dominates the shape of philanthropic citizenship in education. And much of this activity is occurring with little academic research or scrutiny at a primary school level. I think this is problematic. Philanthropic citizenship provides an ideal space for our children and young people and all of us to engage in and consider ideas of social justice, citizenship, civic engagement, kindness and collective action. It is essentially, for me, the beating heart of our civil society, both in the present and the future. And as scholars and as policymakers, practitioners and educators, we need to engage more critically in what is happening in the socialisation of our children in this respect. And as Westenheimer suggests, ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want and what kind of citizen helps us achieve that society? So I finished by proposing a call to action for stakeholders to come together for interdisciplinary scholarship to offer greater scrutiny, understanding and robust data examining philanthropic citizenship for charities, funders and schools to seek to co-produce learning experiences, and most importantly for all of that work, for all of us to work collaboratively with children and young people themselves to enable them to help shape their philanthropic engagement and their philanthropic experiences. My very last slide is this is where we're going with our next steps. We were very lucky to receive ESRC funding last year and our project began in December. And we now have a 3-year project that's now exploring this in greater depth. Myself, Dr. Emily Lau, who's an education scholar, and Dr. Lindsay Cameron, who focuses on how children become social beings, are leading on this. And we are supported by a really fantastic advisory board, Dr. Lee Jerome, who is Associate Professor at the Education and Middlesex University, Professor Dame Alison Peacock, who is CEO of the Chartered College of Teaching, Professor Andrew Peterson, Deputy Director of Jubilee Centre, Louisa Searle, who is the CEO of the charity First Give, Ruth Le Breton, who is the Assistant Director of the Young Leaders Award at the Archbishop of York Youth Trust, and Ashley Hodges, who is the CEO of Young Citizens. And through this project, we're doing our first year of carrying out a wide-scale survey to look at how philanthropic citizenship is encouraged in primary schools. In year 2, we then carry out interviews to really investigate kind of what kind of activities are going on and how that is impacted by different demographics. And then in year 3 is a focus on participatory action research with children. So any of your feedback today and any of your questions, I hope, can feed into us making this as impactful project as possible. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ali. I'll just talk for a couple of minutes while you regain your breath after that. That's so kind of fantastic. There's so much there. It's kind of really authoritative. It's really wide-ranging, and I think we'll look forward to engaging more and reading more about it. Will your slides be available for us? That would be really good if we could, and references as well to follow up.
Yeah, I'll make all the slides available. And I should have said the website that I included on the last slide has copies of all the research papers that I've talked about, so they'll be accessible for everyone as well.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you so much for that. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in the chat, so I'm going to draw on people kind of selectively to ask them if that's okay. So the first one, Kathy, if you're there and want to ask your question in person, that would be good. And then I'll ask the next question because the person's had to leave. So, Kathy?
Yeah, sure. Ali, you did allude to this a little bit towards the end as well, but I was just wondering if there's any research on sort of maybe the potential longer term impacts of the focus of primary education on those intrinsic motivations, so the kind of giving for reward sort of model, and does it override that kind of intrinsic inbuilt sort of altruism that children have? And essentially, do we get less altruistic as we grow up?
So there's certainly some research from psychology, and I think it was Warnaker et al. who kind of present this idea, and they were looking more at kind of the idea of pro-social behaviours, that if we externally reward pro-sociality and pro-social behaviours, that we do override these intrinsic more altruistic behaviours. And so there certainly is some evidence out there that says that this is a concern. In terms of charitable giving, I would suggest that we don't quite have that data yet. I think there was some interesting research that was done by the Jubilee Centre that talks about habit of service and suggests that if we engage younger children in meaningful social action before the age of 10, that they're twice as likely to engage in kind of civil society voluntary action longer term. So I think we've got it on the other side, but I don't think, from what I know, it'd be great to hear if anyone else has further kind of research that I'm not immediately kind of thinking of at this point. But I think it's one of the things that we're trying to track through and look at through this project as well, and ongoing work, is what are those kind of longer term impacts. And I think that I think some kind of really interesting longitudinal studies would be really interesting in that area.
Right, thanks very much, Ali. So next question is from Louise Dorr. Can I bring you in, Louise?
Hello, yes. Thanks very much for that, Ali. Really fascinating and completely new to me. So you've provoked an awful lot of thought. The question I asked in the chat was whether any of your research projects have worked across the nation, be that England or UK, and if so, if you've noticed any national or regional differences there. But I suppose my thinking behind that is that attitudes to philanthropy and philanthropic behaviours are very cultural. So it might be that it's not a regional thing, but some other cultures that you might like to comment on. Thanks.
So certainly what we've, I suppose what we've noticed most of all so far has been more about kind of the social demographic impacts and the opportunities that children have available to them. Majority of the research so far is focused on the southeast, but the ESRC project does go across England. So I certainly hope to have that data over the coming years. But just to give an example of how kind of this, how opportunities play out very differently and in different kind of contexts. I'll draw on interviews with two teachers in which one was talking that they'd both decided, or they were trying to do youth-led fundraising within their school for a cause that the children cared about. And within each school, both schools decided that they were going to do a bake sale. Now, within one school that sat within a kind of prominent wealthy area, they did a bake sale that all the parents brought in lots of lovely cakes. They sold them, they got lots of money. It was a fantastically kind of fundraising success for the children. And then on the other side of it was a school in a very deprived area where the school really found it difficult to get parents to engage in the school. And so their bake sale was very much the teachers bought all of the ingredients, the children spent the whole morning at school baking those cakes. They took them over to the village hall where there was a meeting going on. I think it was alongside the WI, and they engaged in conversations there, and they sold their cakes. Now, in terms of a fundraising success, it wasn't as successful in terms of how much it raised. But I think what's really interesting there is actually what was the children's engagement there, and what did the children learn from those different experiences. But I think what we do see is, as I say, it kind of playing out very differently in different kind of socio-economic areas. But I think that cultural aspect is really important, and we really do hope to pick that up in the ESRC project that we're doing at the moment. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I feel like
it does. No, thank you very much. Yeah, I absolutely can identify with those examples you've given, and yeah, I will check back on the ESRC project. Be really interested to see that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Louise, and thanks, Ali, for answering the questions. Okay, so we've got probably time for a couple more questions, both that have come in the chat. So I'm going to bring Trevor P in, if you're there, Trevor, to ask your question. I can ask it on your behalf if you like, but if you go ahead, that'd be great.
No, I'm still here. Hello, Ali. It's Trevor Pears. How are you? Hi.
Hello, Trevor.
Hi. Yeah, it's fascinating talk. Thank you. Faith and religion doesn't seem to get any, let alone much of a mention. I just wondered what you thought the role of faith in terms of values, social justice, and so on.
I think faith and religion have a really important part to play in this. I think what's important to kind of mention here at this point in time is I don't think we have the data set to be able to have commented too far on it, which is why I haven't kind of brought it up so far. But I think it has a really prominent role. And again, with the ESRC project that we're looking at, faith and religion is one of the kind of dominant themes that we're asking teachers and schools about in terms of how much it influences what's happening. And so again, I'm really sorry, this is almost a wait and see answer, but I certainly hope that survey is going out to teachers just after Easter, and we hope to have the early analysis of it September time, and so I'd hope to be able to kind of comment a lot further then. What we did find in the children's literature work, which wasn't the focus of that work, was that actually there was some really kind of prominent books that were informed by faith and religion that really kind of actively sought to encourage children to engage in ideas of social justice through that lens. And so we certainly saw it there across lots of different religions, but because we were examining the most popular books, they don't feature as much in that article.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ali. So watch this space, and we'll have you back to talk about that when you've been through further work in your project. Last one I just wanted to ask was it's from Chris Dayson, who's had to leave, unfortunately. So he's going to drop the question in the chat, and it was a similar thing that I wanted to ask anyway, which is, you really highlight well that sense of the kind of tension between slightly more kind of progressive notions of social justice and the perhaps regressive notions around character, education and values, etc., and the tensions between them. So Chris asked kind of, that tension is huge, and how can charities and funders, teachers government departments, etc., and children be supported to navigate that tension? Where are the kind of policy levers, and who are the people to influence to help in terms of supporting people to navigate that? Because it strikes me as it's kind of a massively ideological difference as much as anything else. So and fraught with difficulty. So how might people be supported to navigate it?
Gosh, that really is a massive question. I'll do my best to answer it. I do think it is fraught with difficulties at the moment, and unfortunately I think those difficulties are increasing, and I think some of the tensions that we are seeing and some of the discussions and some of the narratives that are within society, we only need to sort of think about some of the really divisive narratives around wokeness and things that are really problematic. And I think what worries me is that teachers especially are incredibly busy people who, whenever I've spoken to them, are passionate about giving their children the kind of the best education and engage in all these critical thinking. But actually, when we're seeing some of these narratives, I think that confidence is being really hit. And so actually there's almost a kind of, I'm doing lots of interviews with teachers at the moment, and there's a real sort of feel and sense of, I'm just not going to go there because actually it's too problematic, and I don't quite know how to deal with it. And this is where I think charities, in terms of what happens on the ground in education, have a really important part to play. And I think there are some, again, and I've said it in the presentation, I think some fantastic funders and some fantastic organisations out there who are giving really clear resource guidance to teachers to help them kind of navigate through that. But I also think philanthropic actors have a duty to be pressing on those kind of policy lever buttons and campaigning for there to be greater clarity in how teachers can navigate this, but also for that more kind of social justice orientation at the moment. I'm happy to say that I don't think the recent DFE guidance was helpful in any of this. And whilst I think when you read it really closely, it's kind of not as bad as I think people maybe immediately assumed, I think the narratives that have surrounded it have been quite negative. So I do think, but I think then we've all got the opportunity to kind of take some of these programs that have been happening, so like the RSA program and the Citizens of Now report, and some of the individual action that's happening in schools, and really talk about actually why and show why this is so successful and this is so important. And I think having research and data to back that up and having children's voices to back that up, for me, would be kind of the way forwards at the moment. But I do think it is a huge challenge in our current system.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's a really kind of reflexive thought about the challenges and difficulties that people face when you want to try and shift agendas and shift narratives in such a kind of fraught way at the moment. I
will just add to that, Rob, though, that I don't think we can underestimate how powerful children's voices are, and that actually I think the more we allow children's voices to come through, so it not being my voice, not being kind of all, but actually children's voices to come through on this as well, and the more we facilitate that, I do think that would be really helpful in shifting narratives and agendas as well.
Yes, thank you for that. It's a really good reminder, because I was about to say, a reminder to me really, because I was about to say, one of the ways in which you can open up the possibilities and navigate the tensions is by talking about it. It's by, these kinds of presentations, this kind of research, and the kind of, progressive people, RSA, etc., that are trying to think through these things, opening up that there are alternatives, there are other ways of thinking. But that's not to lose sight, absolutely, as you say, of kind of children's voices in this picture as well, because they are hugely important. It's 11 o'clock, so our time has run against us. So I just want to kind of thank you, Ali, for a fantastic presentation, really thought-provoking, lots of food for thought. We've got lots of thoughts that have come in the chat. So in our Zoom-related ways, if we can kind of thank Ali in the traditional style, or in the Zoom-related traditional style that we've come across, that would be really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share my work with you.
Great, we'll make the slides available. There's a recording available as well. What I ought to just mention, just to, as we wrap up, is that the next seminar will be due on the 11th of May. at 3:30, and it's around homelessness prevention and policing homelessness with colleagues from Manchester Metropolitan University and Sheffield Hallam University. Thank you to colleagues behind the scenes for making the seminar work, and also thank you again, Ali, from everybody for a fantastic presentation, and so great. And farewell, everybody. I hope you have good days and good rests of weeks. Thank you.